Welcome back to the London Futurists podcast. If you enjoy the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review on your podcast platform. It helps others to find us. Feel free also to send us questions and suggestions. Also, we're looking for sponsors to fund a marketing initiative to help reach a wider audience. The future is rushing towards us, and the better informed we all are, the better it will be. Our topic this week is investing in AI, so we're delighted to have as our guest John Cassidy, a partner at Kindred Capital, a UK-based venture capital firm. Before he became an investment professional, John co-founded CCG.ai, a precision oncology company which exited to Dante Labs in 2019. John, welcome to the London Futurist podcast.
Hi both, good to see you.
Thanks for joining us, John.
John, why don't we start by you telling us about Kindred Capital? How big is it? When was it founded? What sort of investments it specializes in? And any particular investee companies you'd like to showcase?
Of course, thanks. So Kindred, we were about 7 or 8 years old as a firm. So it was founded by a couple of my partners that are still here, Layla and Mark, and then later joined by myself, Chris, and Maria. So about 7 years old. We're on Fund 3. Each fund tends to be about $100 million. Fund 3 is a little bit larger, at $130 million. So we really like to try and stay relatively small as far as venture capital firms go, because we are very focused on pre-seed and seed stage investments, and we like to be quite disciplined there. In terms of what we invest in, we like to say that we invest in platforms, picks and shovels. So this is the kind of orchestration or infrastructure layer across many different vertical platforms. So be that biotechnology or SaaS or fintech, we like to be in that kind of nitty gritty kind of detailed layer, allowing lots of different vertical applications to work. I think our last publicly announced investment was a seed investment into a company called Olus Medical, which is based in Belfast. So that's a medical software layer for all of that siloed non-patient medical information that you may find in a hospital. So everything around guidelines and schedules and other information which is kind of not related to individual patients, but is more related to the operations of the hospital. So that tends to be very siloed information, as I say, tends to be kept on ring binders or in random drop boxes or down the back of the nurse's station. And Olus takes all that information and puts it on one platform and makes it accessible to healthcare professionals. So that's the most recently announced investment, I think. I think in the context of this conversation, it's probably worth mentioning a couple of our other kind of AI-focused investments. One of them that listeners might know about is a company called Cradle Bio, which is a generative AI tooling layer for protein engineers. So it enables protein engineers to use the power of deep learning and protein folding to kind of come up with better proteins for multiple different applications, be that in medicine or industrial enzymes or in other places. And as well, it's probably worth mentioning a company called Scarlet, which is, if you think about all of the medical software applications that we can imagine trying to get into the clinic over the next couple of years, we're really going to have to upskill how we deal with compliance and how we think about regulating those medical softwares. And so Scarlet are building a continuous compliance infrastructure for regulated industries, initially starting with the medical software application. So yeah, that's us. Like I say, pre-seed and seeds, $130 million. We like to be very founder-focused, like to come in early, and we make investments in the UK, Europe, and Israel.
Excellent sketch. Thank you. I love the fact that there's a job title, protein engineer. That sounds very science fiction. I think, and I should know this, I think you had an investment in self-driving cars. Was it 5AI?
That's right, yeah.
How is that doing?
So 5AI exited to Bosch a few years ago, which was great.
Shows how up to date I am.
And Stan, I think, we were talking about him in our partners meeting today. I think he's one of the most continually great builders in the UK ecosystem. So he's he's currently at Bosch and kind of thinking about how he can help other founders and other kind of builders in the ecosystem make the UK punch above its weight on the global scale.
So, but you do specialize in AI-related investments at Kindred. How is the investment community thinking about AI at the moment? Is it a gold rush or a bubble in the making? And what difference has GPT-4 made to it all?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think there's a lot of excitement, and I think when I get together with other investors, there's definitely a feeling that, you know, maybe in some aspects of AI, maybe there's a bit of bubble-like behavior going on, and this is something that, you know, we do tend to do as an industry, which is maybe not a very popular thing to say, but you know, we did it in crypto a couple of years ago, and we did it in .com companies in 2000, and we did it in 10-minute groceries a few years ago, and there's this you know, a new sector comes along and we all get excited about the potential and we all fund it very heavily early on, and you know, some of those investments don't go very well. So I think there's quite a lot of hubris and there's quite a lot of excitement, and I honestly think that some people, not just in the investment community but more broadly, are mistaking LLMs for AGI, for artificial general intelligence, I think, in some of the capabilities that we're talking about. But I think underlying that hubris and that kind of excitement that maybe you can take with a pinch of salt, I think there's some great stuff happening, and we are seeing, you know, real advances in using AI and using things like GPT inside big organizations and small organizations. So I'm really hopeful that this is real. I'm really hopeful that it doesn't become overhyped and overfunded and then leaves a lot of people disappointed. And I think we just have to be a little bit more disciplined about where we deploy capital, and are we deploying capital into the most tech-like parts of the ecosystem.
I lived through the dot-com crash. I saw lots of companies making fools of themselves and losing out. But on the other hand, there were companies who thrived through that downturn. Some of the greatest big tech companies of today were very successful in their own ways through that dot-com crash. Do you think it's the same with LLMs and the systems that can be built with LLMs, of which, of course, there will be more and more sophisticated combinations of software, not just the LLMs themselves, but the other connections and combinations that are built? Do you foresee that kind of future for the LLM bubble?
I like how we're both calling it a bubble. People aren't going to like us. But I definitely do think so. I think, I mean, when you looked at the early days of the dot-com bubble and then crisis, I guess there were a lot of companies built then, you know, thinking about Microsoft and thinking about Amazon. They were built in those kind of days that ended up being huge players going forward. I think it's difficult to predict which one of the companies that are building today are going to be those lasting companies. And I think when you think about the foundation models and how they interact with the rest of the ecosystem, if you think about OpenAI, for example, I think a lot of which companies are going to survive long term is going to come down to where those big tech companies and those big foundational model companies decide to play, where they think that they're going to get the best returns. And I think it's illustrative, I think, if you look at the GPU market and NVIDIA and TSMC and people like that actually build the chips. The NVIDIA designing the chips, and then TSMC kind of founding or making the chips through their foundries, and thinking about where the value is captured in that arrangement. And I think in both cases there's a huge amount of demand being driven into the chip industry, but it's NVIDIA and NVIDIA's share price that's really capturing the majority of that value rather than the foundries. And so it remains to be seen where in the AGI software layer, so where in the LLM software stack, are we going to see that sustained competitive advantage and that sustained pricing power that allows huge companies to last long term. But definitely, as you say, a lot in the tooling layer, a lot in the infrastructure layer, and probably a lot of the application layers, probably a lot of the ones that are out there getting distribution, getting into the hands of users today. Probably some of them are going to turn into decacorns in the future, which is exciting.
It does strike me that we're in a very different situation from the dot-com bubble, which I also lived through, and did the usual thing of leaving a very good job to do a startup, which was ill-advised. But back then, even the companies which have prospered mightily, Google, and then Facebook was much later, but Google particularly, it had no business model. Google had no idea how it was going to make money in 1999, and it was only later that it discovered advertising and the fact that it could basically steal the advertising market from Rupert Murdoch, which personally I think is a great service to humankind. But so, what we've got now is products which have very obvious applications and very obvious ways of making money. These foundation models make it much quicker to do a lot of the work that people do, and that is a huge improvement in efficiency. So I think it's quite a different sort of situation. We don't know how it's going to shape out at all. We don't know whether large companies are going to start encouraging their people and indeed training their people how to use foundation models, or whether they're going to remain skittish for a long time. But undoubtedly, people are going to make a lot of money by making processes right across the economy much more efficient. In fact, it remains a puzzle to me that 6 months after the launch of ChatGPT and 3 months after the launch of GPT-4, we're not really seeing a big impact on GDP because of this greater efficiency. But it will come. People like NVIDIA are making the shovels, and it's often said that if you're in a boom, then don't try to pan for gold, but sell shovels to the people who are panning for gold, which I guess is sometimes good advice, but it's worth bearing in mind that the people who invested in the infrastructure in the last technological revolution, in the various stages of the industrial revolution, people who invested in canals and railways mostly lost their shirt. It's just really hard to see who are going to be the winners, but there's going to be a lot of winners, I think, in this current phase. And I'm glad it's you rather than me that's got that job, John, of figuring out which ones are going to be the winners.
Yeah, we can try. But I think that's a really interesting point about canals and railway infrastructure. Obviously, it played out a little bit differently in the mobile revolution and the cloud revolution, but definitely not all increases in global GDP or huge kind of innovative steps in the economy are equal. I think it's not necessarily a question of will value be generated and captured with the release of GPTs and LLMs. It's more who in that stack is going to capture the most value. So yes, maybe it's the application layer, but what about the data providers, right? What about the Reddits of the world and kind of what they're going through right now with their moderators' backlash against selling data? And obviously that was the original data that 3.5 was trained on, and then 4 was, maybe trained on some other stuff. And will any of the value go back to them? We just don't know.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
The People in Performance podcast offers insights into the strategic competencies, behaviors, and results needed to increase the performance of employees and leaders. The show looks at all areas of the world of work, including attraction and recruitment, onboarding, training, and succession planning. Tune in to get a better handle on the stages of workforce planning you need to master in order to guarantee long-term success in a rapidly changing world of work. New episodes drop each week. Check out the latest People in Performance episodes on your podcast platform of choice. Follow us on socials and read the latest articles at pppod.com.
Perhaps I can ask then how money is made by protein engineering. Is it with access to lots of data about proteins? Is it with some special algorithms which go beyond that which is available to other people? Is there some other sustainable way to benefit financially from that skill?
Yeah, I think traditionally the way that you make money as any kind of protein engineer is a very asset-heavy model. So if you create a drug that is good, it looks good in preclinical work and early clinical work, then you have royalties and milestones associated with that drug as it goes to patients, and you have a monopoly over that protein species. And so and then there's that model in the kind of pharmaceutical industry, which obviously protein, maybe listeners aren't necessarily aware, but a lot of the best-selling drugs in the world are protein drugs, essentially. So Humira is an antibody drug, which was the best-selling drug for the last 10 years or so. And there are many more new drugs which are fragments of antibodies, or they're enzyme fragments, or they're other kind of bits of protein that are pretty useful as biologic drugs. But I think that model of a lot of high upfront cost and spend, and then downstream value capture through royalties and milestones, through partnering with people who own distribution. So pharmaceutical companies own distribution. They're the ones who are going around hospitals and selling drugs. I think a lot of that model is going to other areas of the protein engineering world. So if you think about an industrial enzyme that is maybe good at converting compound X to compound Y, maybe it's the value capture there to the people that make the enzyme in the first place maybe follows a similar route. I think in terms of where Cradle specifically is playing, it's more about, okay, there is an existing economy based around designing and engineering proteins, be that in industrial applications or in pharmaceutical applications, but those people who are doing that job are struggling to understand how to apply machine learning and apply tools like AlphaFold to their work. So how do we make it easier for them to take these learnings and these software and apply that day to day in their world? And so Cradle is much more of that kind of software layer, enabling access to protein engineers or to models by protein engineers.
And if Google were to release AlphaFold 3, for example, is that going to turn upside down everything that companies like Cradle Bio are doing?
I think it depends on the efficiency gain or the accuracy gain in AlphaFold 3. And certainly it feels like AlphaFold 2 is pretty good. And maybe maybe 3 is not that much better. And there's AlphaFold allows you to understand from a sequence what is the three-dimensional shape of an enzyme or a protein, sorry. It doesn't tell you, okay, we want to use that protein at high temperature, how do we optimize it? Right? And so I think there's a lot of side work that's done in tailoring these purely academic models or purely academic programs towards being a product. And if AlphaFold 3 is released, I think I would imagine Google will release it open source as they did with 1 and 2.
It's worth, just for those listeners who don't know what AlphaFold is, it's the system launched by DeepMind, which has now been merged with Google Brain, which predicts the folding behavior of proteins. AlphaFold 1 predicted, I think, the folding behavior of about 1 million, and then AlphaFold 2 predicted the folding behavior of about 200 million proteins, which is pretty much all of life on Earth, which was a remarkable achievement. It was a very long-standing challenge in biology, and fantastic that they gave this benefit to the world as an open source system. Is the secret sauce in your business, John, is it identifying which parts of the value chain are going to be where the money is made, or which parts of a process, or is it identifying which players within each strata are the most likely winners? I guess it's probably both, but is it more one or the other?
I think the secret sauce maybe I can add a comment to the AlphaFold thing and then answer the question. Yeah, I think that is exactly what AlphaFold does. I think what is worth thinking about as well is that out of all of the possible proteins in the world, the ones that have been studied and have been found in nature is like a grain of sand on a beach on an island. There's an almost infinite number of proteins that could theoretically be designed to do specific purposes, and I think that's where the generative part of generative AI comes in here. Cool. And then to answer your question, it was the secret sauce. I think this secret sauce really of my business is about finding the best founders. And that kind of sounds like a bit of a cop-out and a bit of a sly answer, but I honestly think that at the pre-seed and seed stage, which is where we invest, I think it's really the only thing that matters. Everything about the business model, everything about the go-to-market and the products and the technology and the IP, that is all going to change in the journey. And actually having great technology today is not a perfect predictor of being a $10 billion company in the future. I think there's a lot of steps on that journey. And when you look at some great technical companies in the UK's history, so Celexa, for example, which is the Cambridge spin-out that enabled DNA sequencing, that was a great technology, but it needed Illumina and Illumina's scale to really get that technology out to the world. And it's only together they could create the $30 billion company. And my job, I think, as I see it, is about trying to identify individuals that have an outside chance, they have a spark, they have that kind of creative destruction in their being, that means that maybe they could see that whole journey. Maybe they can do the early days, maybe they can do the middle bit, maybe they can do the post-IPO growth. And obviously it's a bit difficult to do that. Training your internal algorithms is quite difficult because it's quite a long time horizon, but that's really what I see the major value that I can generate is.
And does that come down to identifying really, really talented founders?
It is talented founders, yes. I mean, I think talent goes without saying. It's also about people who are irrational enough to think that they can create a company the size of Illumina. Because you have to be pretty irrational to think you can do that as like a scientist, to say, oh, you know what, I'm going to develop a breakthrough technology and then I'm going to commercialize it in a box and I'm going to sell that box to every single hospital in the world. That's an irrational person. And so I think it's about having that ambition, having that rationality in your being, and also just being super talented and super driven. And I think there are very few people in the world that can do that. And it's just about trying to find people like that and trying to help them on that journey, I think.
Yeah, it's been observed that there are two types of entrepreneurs. One type are people who were kind of just in the right place at the right time. They observed the company that they were working for was doing something badly wrong and decided to set up a new firm and do it better. And they already had all the sort of industry expertise required. And then there's another type, the really sort of dyed in the wool, born to be entrepreneurs, people who could never be a happy employee. And they are people who are capable literally of lifting themselves up into the air by their own shoelaces, or just bashing their heads against a brick wall enough times that the brick wall does fall over, and despite the fact that it really shouldn't. And it's an interesting psychological balance, that, because you have to believe things that are impossible, and yet you have to also be smart enough to do things that require great judgment. So it's a remarkable combination of skills.
100%. I think it's maybe Adam Grant or maybe somebody else that talks about fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence, and how, throughout our lives we kind of go from more fluid intelligence and then to more crystallized intelligence as we start to understand the processes of the world and how the world works. And I think a great founder really almost has to have both in a lot of industries, right? You can't just have the crystallized intelligence which tells you, okay, this is how the drug development industry works. You also have to have the fluid intelligence, which is, why does it have to work like that? And what about if I changed it a little bit? And holding those two opposing things in your head they're very, unique individuals, I think.
Yeah. And
luck as well plays a massive role in this, obviously.
Sure. Is being located in the UK a disadvantage to you, do you think, compared to being located on Sand Hill Road in Silicon Valley?
So I built my company for 6 years between Cambridge and San Francisco, and I prefer the UK. I think, I fell in love with Cambridge when I arrived for, I think, PhD interviews or something, and I heard people in a pub talking about chemical engineering and talking about protein folding and talking about naval architecture, like really geeky topics. And as a kid from Glasgow, I loved that. And when I arrived in California, I was sitting in a pub because this is what I do. And I was listening to some people from Twitter, and then some people that had just got into YC, and some people bootstrapping an app or whatever. And that it was almost the same as Cambridge had that crystallized intelligence, that fluid intelligence was being shown in San Francisco, and that radical ambition, and everybody's building something, which is amazing and it's exciting, and I can totally see why the Valley is so successful. And then so there's the kind of the type of people that congregate there, and then there's the learned behavior in the institutions that they know how to allow a company to get to a large size, and that is everything from Stanford taking a low percentage of a company when they spin out to local employment and tax laws, to the growth capital being available, and then the learned experience from the operators who have seen success one or two times, or the dentist who put $5,000 into Google and became a millionaire. There's a lot of like learned experience in that ecosystem, which is really powerful. I think the UK has, and Europe broadly, has a lot to learn, but in terms of the raw ingredients, I think we've got a lot of the great stuff here, and especially in the two kind of revolutions that I care about, which is the tech bio revolution, or technology applied to biology, and the AI revolution. I think the UK has a huge advantage in the talent of the people that are coming up, and you see that, OpenAI opened up their first international office, and where did they open it? They opened it in London, right? It wasn't Montreal, which is probably the biggest machine learning place in the world until the last 5 years. It was in London, which is really exciting. So there's a lot we can learn, but I think the raw ingredients are great here.
The universities and the presence of DeepMind give the UK an enormous advantage compared to the rest of Europe. And you've already broached some of the reasons why Silicon Valley is so successful. Do you, and I hope you're not bored with this question, it's a perennial question, why do you think Europe, and including the UK, really has no tech giants? I mean, there's not a shortage of talent or ambition in Europe, and there's not a shortage of money either. So why is there a shortage of growth capital, or is it just the lack of a single market, or is it something else entirely?
I think there's a few things that all feed into it. I think there was a story that somebody told me once about how at the same time as California had Genentech, we had British Biotech, which turned out to be a bit of a challenging company, and Genentech was a huge success. And there are a few examples where we have something and the Valley has something and theirs works, and maybe that's luck, but it does build this kind of feeling in one's head that maybe we shouldn't be quite so risk-takey because we've not seen the full potential of the upside. Then I think there's some other issues, I do think. I think we're still afraid to fail in Europe in general, some places more than others, but I think it is very, very accepted in the Valley that you try a company, you raise a bit of money for a company, you try it for 6 months, you don't get traction and you close it down. And that's totally fine. That's totally fine. And I think in the UK and Europe, there's still a feeling of like, oh my God, I failed. That's terrible. And it's not a failure. It's not a failure. It's part of the process, right? If you're a scientist and you do an experiment and the experiment doesn't work, you don't cry over it and try the experiment again. You move on. Your hypothesis updates and you train your algorithms and you get better. So I think we can be a bit more comfortable with failure would be great. And then if we could see one or two examples of real success stories to get that ambition ingrained in our brains, I think would be great. There is there's an interesting thing, I think, which is happening more so in Europe than the US right now, which is there's a lot of government regulation. There's a lot of whispers about regulation, about both about AI, but also maybe interfering with big M&A and interfering with like the ARM purchase and things like that. And it's just if you do that, you are kind of limiting what a tech company can do in Europe. Because if we can't build a great company and then sell it, then our only option is to IPO. And if we're going to IPO, we're probably going to IPO in the NASDAQ because the FTSE is not doing too great. And so it almost feels like there's an effort to restrain companies in the UK right now, which is really upsetting to me. So yeah, be more comfortable with failure, be more comfortable with large exits. Maybe don't immediately jump to regulation. I think regulation is important, safety is important, but also it's not the only thing. There's also a lot of good that can be done, and maybe we just have to take a little bit of that Silicon Valley mantra of move fast and break things and, apologize later.
On that subject of regulations, I noticed that the UK is trying to position itself as being a smart regulator of safe AI solutions. The United Nations Security Council is scheduled to meet on the 18th of July, chaired by James Cleverly, the UK Foreign Secretary, and the subject is how to ensure that AI is safe in military and security and so on. What regulations, if anything, might be adopted? So there is this field of regulations, and we can all shudder at misapplication of it. We can all be afraid of the damping effects on innovation. But I did notice with interest earlier you mentioned the company Scarlett, which was trying to, in some sense, streamline the regulatory system to allow companies to be continuously monitored and to prove in a possibly a more productive way that their products were efficacious, safe and whatever. So are you advocating in general that we should do regulation better, or are you saying let's just back off on the regulation and allow 100 flowers to bloom more fully than they are at current?
No, that's a good point, and obviously nothing is kind of black and white. But I think so. Scarlett, in particular, I think addresses a problem that in regulated industries, the current systems of compliance and regulation are not built for software application. So when you build a medical device, typically you would update the regulators once a year or so and tell them what changes you plan to make. And that doesn't really work with software. It doesn't really work with an agile software environment. And so how do you take an existing regulatory environment which is built to ensure safety of patients, which is paramount, and how do you update that and maintain those standards but make it easier for software innovations to get into the healthcare system or to get into any regulated market? And that specifically, I think, is where Scarlett is playing. And just on the topic of regulation more broadly, I mean, I had the conversation with Neil Lawrence recently, who's the DeepMind professor of AI at Cambridge, and he was talking about regulation, and he was saying, look, I've been building in this space for whatever, 10 years or something, or 15 years, 20 years. And I'm on the board of various bodies that have been trying to regulate for the last 10 years. And we have frameworks to do it. We are working on it. We've deeply thought about this. And all we have to do is to kind of expand and continue with those efforts. We don't need people like me or people like you or people that kind of have a kind of tangential idea of what's going on to come in and start applying regulation on top of what experts in the field, I think, are already doing. So it's not about removing regulation. I think it's about doing smart regulation and realizing that there is a danger that we over-regulate a space.
You mentioned in remarks about what makes Silicon Valley special, the mindset and perhaps a more flexible approach to regulation. There's also typically people think it's about the fact that America has a massive single market, which of course, and Europe has an imperfect single market, which of course doesn't stop very large companies being developed. There are very large pharmaceutical companies, very large luxury brand companies, but there may be something specifically about technology which really needs a large single market to allow these companies to grow and to blitz scale. Is it, from your point of view as an investor based in the UK, how much of a problem is it that we're no longer part of the European single market, or do you think is that not something that's affecting you at all yet?
I mean, personally, I'm very upset, but I think as an investor, I think it is a challenge, right? It's a challenge, but I do think that any company which is going to be a large company, the kind of companies that I want to get involved with early on, are companies that are going to go to more than one market and they're going to cross borders. And even the best European success stories, the Spotifys and the TransferWise and the UiPath and people like that have moved across Europe and then they've moved into the US. And the US is also an imperfect single market, right? Selling to somebody in Texas is different from selling to somebody in New York, at least in medical world or in pharmaceutical world or in various other kind of regulated industries where the states have different says on what happens, and customer behavior is very different. And so I think any company that is going to succeed is going to have to be able to sell to different jurisdictions. Whether having an immediate large single market is a disadvantage, yeah, maybe it's more of a challenge. But also, it allows you to leapfrog and play in different areas. And so there was a podcast that the founder of Daniel Ek, the founder of Spotify, did recently, where he talked about how the reason he could crack the US is because he went to the UK first. And so he had this kind of Swedish company, and he had to go to the UK and change some things about how the company works. And if he hadn't done that stop on the way, he wouldn't have actually managed to conquer the US in his opinion. And I apologize, I'm probably doing a terrible job of recounting his story. But I think that the best founders are going to have to get over it.
Perhaps we could start winding up by looking to the future. After all, this is the London Futurists podcast. You've talked about current investments, areas where you think AI can make a difference now. Are there possible sectors that could be impacted in the not too distant future in new ways by AI that maybe investors and the rest of us should be keeping an eye open for?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very excited about what could happen in the future. I think, I do believe that there is one leap, if you like, one technology leap that is required to get to artificial general intelligence. And obviously, we'll all be waiting for that. But in the absence of that happening, I think the current technology has a lot of application to go into the industry. And when you look at the predictions from Goldman Sachs and others that say that large language models and GPTs are going to increase the GDP of the world by 7% or 7 trillion or 14 trillion, it's actually quite difficult to make that happen. So how do you apply GPT inside NatWest, for example? Like, what are the implications for security? What are the implications for privacy? How do you clean the data? How do you put the data together? Do you need to train a new model? I think these are all questions that are variously getting answered by different startups, and different startups are doing different parts of that puzzle. And there's definitely a lot of opportunity still to go. I think personally, if there are any aspiring AI founders out there, I'd love to see something in clinical trial design or in later stage clinical trials. I think it is a very inefficient process, and a lot of the innovation that you hear about in AI drug discovery is all at that preclinical end, or mostly at that preclinical end. It's all about how do we come up with a new molecule. And the vast majority of spending inside a pharmaceutical company happens at the tail end, at the phase 3 trials and the phase 2 trials. And that's where very small increases in efficiency, very small efficiency gains can get medicines to patients much, much faster and save a bunch of money, both for the companies but also for payers, which is us basically, it's governments and insurers. So I'd love to see somebody building in that space or other people building in that space. But I think there are a lot of great companies that can be built at different layers of the stack. It's going to be difficult. The ground is kind of shifting under our feet. We don't know, is OpenAI going to go to the application layer? Are they going to take the entire tooling and orchestration layer? We don't know. And the ground is going to change, and some companies will build something and then it'll be disrupted, but that is the nature of the business that we're in.
I'm sure you're very familiar with in silico medicine. We had Alexander Zhavoronkov, the co-founder, on a couple of episodes ago. And as I'm sure you know, he's now got an AI-developed drug into phase 2 clinical trials. His in clinico system, which is the third part of his sort of troika of AI systems that develop drugs, is all about predicting and impacting the way that clinical trials are conducted. Is he on the right track, do you think, or is there something completely new required?
No, I think that's a great start. But I mean, as always with these things, there are going to be multiple companies that can win in this space. It's a huge amount of money which is spent, and I think there are many people that can win. But it's about, even as small a thing as during COVID, we ran some massive, amazing trials in the UK, And what happened to that infrastructure? Why can we not still do that? What are the barriers to doing that? And how do we try and fix some of those barriers with innovation and technology?
Yeah. Well, one thing's for sure is that in a period of exponential technology growth, there's going to be a lot of tremendous investment opportunities, and I'm sure you're going to have a very interesting next decade or two.
Yeah, send them all my way.
Listeners, you had that invitation. Act on it.
John, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you both very much.
Thank you.